Hey there, in this tutorial I will show you these data binding types in Angular 17. If you are only interested in one or two of them, feel free to use the timecodes to skip around. As always, the link to the Github repository of the final project is in the description. To demonstrate the bindings, we create a new Angular app and we add two components to it. The first is named country and the second is named city. We add these extra components to test data binding between parent and child components over the course of this tutorial. I put one country selector in the app template and two city selectors in the country template. For this to work, you need to import country in the app component and city in the country component. For string interpolation, we start by giving the country a name. To do this, we create a name property in the component and then call this property in double curly brackets in the template. This establishes a one-way data binding from the component to the template. This also works for numbers, as proven by the total population property we will be using later. The second way to get data from the component to the template is property binding. To showcase this, we will add a new div around the template code we have written so far. The div can be given a class, and if we have defined a style named content box, it would be applied. To property bind the class attribute, create a new CSS class property in the country component. We bind the CSS class property to the class attribute by putting the class keyword in square brackets. Inside the quotes we put the property name we want to bind to, instead of the class name. Once we create the CSS class, we can see it being applied. So far we have covered property binding within the same component. Now we will bind properties across components. To do this, we add two new properties to hold city names. Then we go to our child component. Here we create a property with the input decorator. We can display this property using string interpolation. Right now the city name string is empty. We can bind the city names we have prepared in the country component to the city name property of the city component using square brackets. This works because the city name property has the input decorator. Once we save, both cities show up. For event binding, we start by creating a population property in the city component and displaying it with string interpolation. We then add a button, which uses parentheses on the click event for event binding. Right now we are getting an error because we are missing the IncPop method we want to bind to. Once the IncPop method is added, we can test the event binding. As the next step, we will send an event from our child component, the city, to our parent component, the country. To do so, we add the pop event with an add output decorator to the city component. For now, we will only send the current population count. So we add number as the generic part of the event emitter. And in IncPop we then emit the event, so every time we click the button, the current population is sent to the country. For the country to receive the population, we need to change a few things. First, we need to bind the pop event from the city to a method in the country component. We do this by adding the pop event to the selector of the city component in the country template. We bind to the addPop method in the country component. The parameter we use in the template is event. In the method implementation, the event parameter needs to have the same type as we used in the generic part of the event emitter. For now, this is a number. When we click the button now, we can see that the country's population follows the city's population. But maybe we want to know which city is sending the population. To achieve this, we can send an object instead of a number. Let's create a new model class by opening the terminal and entering ng generate class city -- type equals model. There's nothing special in this model, just the city name and the population count. Now we can switch the number in the generic part of the event emitter for the city class. In the IncPop method we then create a new city object and emit it. To receive this city object in the country component, we need to change the parameter of the addPop method from number to city. Add a log to test if it works. Total pop now increases by 1 each time either of the cities adds population. To add two-way binding, we need to import the forms module. After that, we add a tax rate property. In the template, we create an input which binds ngModel in parentheses and brackets to the tax rate property. ngModel is what we needed the forms module for. As you can see, two-way binding is achieved by a combination of the event binding and the property binding syntax. When we add another string interpolation, we can see that the tax rate is updated as soon as we type. Let's add another button. This button sets the tax rate to 5% via event binding. As the last part of this tutorial, we will create a two-way binding between the city and the country component. For this, we add the input decorator to the tax rate and we create tax rate change decorated with output. What is important here is that the name of the output property has to be the name of the input property followed by change. In the city component, we will emit a string and we will do so in the setTax method. We then switch to the country template. Here we bind the city tax rate to a master tax property, which we need to create in the country component. As you can see, we are using the same syntax as before. We just put the child property in parentheses in brackets. Once we have added the master tax via string interpolation in the template, we can click the tax button to see the tax rate sent to the country. If we remove the flat 5% tax rate from the setTax method, we can enter any tax rate we want and send it to the country. To achieve true two-way data binding, we need to be able to set the tax rate from the country as well. So we add an input field, in which we use ngModel to two-way bind the master tax property to the input element. To do this, we also need to import the forms module in the country component. If you don't want to use a button to send the tax rate to the country, you could use a key-up event on the city's input element. Happy coding!